Hello, Natasha from Crime Squad Podcast here. When I released the last episode of Command and Controversy, it was not my intent to wait over 6 months to release another episode. Life has a funny way of throwing some curveballs. I hope you'll come back and listen to this episode of my limited series, Command and Controversy, The Rise and Fall of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. In this episode, we uncover the story behind the unethical drug trial, the lawsuits now surfacing, and the questions that won't go away. Was mefloquine the gasoline that accelerated the violence in Somalia? Let's jump right in. Before the torture, before the cover-ups, before the trials and televised hearings, there was a pill. A small, bitter tablet that every soldier in the Canadian Airborne Regiment swallowed before stepping foot in Somalia. It was a new antimalarial drug. Now, decades later, a disturbing pattern has emerged from those who took this drug. Suicides, violence, and legal action. This is Episode 4, Bitter Medicine. When Canadian soldiers deploy overseas, especially to tropical climates, it becomes the Department of National Defense's responsibility to make sure they're medically prepared. These aren't optional guidelines. They're strict policy-driven health requirements and integral to disease and injury prevention. Before deployment, every member of the Canadian Armed Forces goes through a comprehensive medical readiness process. Physical exams, dental checks, psychological assessments, a review of their medical employment limitations, and mandatory vaccinations or inoculations. There are also educational components, with each service member being well informed about the risks specific to each deployment location. This includes knowledge about hygiene, sanitation, food safety, local insects, environmental hazards. All these things matter. And they matter a lot. If you've ever traveled to a tropical country and accidentally drank the tap water, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, here's a fact that will really drive home the importance of preventative medicine. In 1895, during France's conquest of Madagascar, only around 30 soldiers were killed in combat, compared to the 6,000 soldiers who died from complications of malarial infection. When there's an active deployment, the most common health problems among soldiers are infections, from gastrointestinal to skin and respiratory infections. It makes sense because when you're suddenly exposed to new bacteria and viruses, your body doesn't always immediately understand what's required to fight those infections. And malaria isn't something most Canadians ever think about. But in many parts of the world, it's a serious, sometimes deadly parasitic disease. Malaria spreads through the bite of an infected mosquito, and in severe cases, it can lead to complications like seizures or organ failure. Somalia is considered a high-risk region, and so, in doing their required duty of keeping soldiers safe and healthy, Canadian soldiers were given mefloquine. They were told it was an antimalarial drug. What they weren't told was that the drug wasn't fully approved, and it was known to cause severe psychiatric side effects: aggression, paranoia, hallucinations, just to name a few. When the Airborne Regiment deployed to Somalia in 1992, the Canadian government was scrambling. They wanted to deploy as quickly as possible for the UN mission. They knew Somalia had high levels of malaria. They knew traditional drugs like chloroquine weren't effective anymore. And they knew they needed a solution, fast. They began dosing service members prior to deployment to prepare them and get the medication in their systems. Some tolerated it without issue, but others reported symptoms like intense dreams, dizziness, agitation, and feeling off. They were told there was nothing to worry about. The troubling symptoms were pushed aside for convenience reasons. After all, the drug was effective. And ultimately, the long-term research on the neurological and psychiatric side effects was limited at best. Mefloquine, also known by the brand name Lariam, was an emerging antimalarial drug in the 1990s. It was a necessary development because the effects of chloroquine, the primary antimalarial drug of choice since the 1950s, was becoming significantly less effective as time progressed. In the 1970s, during the Vietnam War, a new strain of gene-mutated malaria emerged and rapidly spread throughout Southeast Asia. A reported 124 members of the U.S. military died, with malaria being the culprit. Even more staggering was the fact that over 24,000 U.S. service members contracted the disease, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of sick days, over 300,000 in total, which significantly impacted military operations. Chloroquine wasn't working like it used to, and after Vietnam, the U.S. military worked to develop an alternative option. This is how mefloquine was born. Clinical trials began in 1975, with the testing targeted specifically at military personnel and prison inmates. In clinical trials, there are laws and regulations that must be upheld. The participant must be fully informed of the risks and adverse reactions. The participant must acknowledge these risks and provide informed consent to proceed. There are also mandatory medical briefings and private consultations to document any side effects, which must be reported to the governing body in charge of the clinical trial. In the early 1990s, mefloquine was beginning to gain a bad reputation. A bitter taste, unpredictable side effects, and a growing number of troubling reports from around the world. Clinical trials revealed side effects such as intense nightmares, confusion, disorientation, anxiety, mood swings, unusual sensory experiences, and, in rare cases, severe psychological reactions. The United States issued warnings related to the drug. Australia put restrictions on the use of the drug for deployments. And some countries even required mental health screening before they would prescribe it. These results were well known to the Department of National Defence and Health Canada. Health Canada hadn't officially approved the drug for use. But on paper, mefloquine made perfect sense. One pill taken weekly, and much more effective than chloroquine. For the Canadian Department of National Defence, this seemed like an efficient, simple solution for large-scale deployment. Health Canada agreed to allow the usage of the drug, but they indicated it needed to be considered a clinical trial for investigational use. The Department of National Defence was required to inform soldiers, obtain consent to proceed, and conduct regular medical briefings to document any symptoms or adverse side effects to be reported back to Health Canada. Spoiler alert, the soldiers were in no way, shape, or form made aware they were entering into an official drug study. They didn't know they could refuse the drug. They didn't know the drug had even been approved for use. All they knew was they were headed on a peacekeeping mission and malaria prevention was in the form of a pill. This bitter medicine had consequences that wouldn't be realized until it was far too late. Manic Monday, Psycho Tuesday, Wacky Wednesday, Freaky Friday. These are the nicknames soldiers gave to the days they were given their weekly dose of mefloquine. It was a way to try and create humor to lessen the horrific reality. The drug was altering the behavior and creating unrest among the soldiers receiving their dose. In episode 1, we learned the Airborne Regiment was already struggling with discipline problems. Racism was prevalent. Drinking was seemingly out of control, and all of this, combined with deeply fractured leadership, was a recipe for disaster. Adding a strong neuroactive drug into an extremely unstable environment was a very risky combination. Obviously, I can't say for sure that mefloquine caused the violence that led Shadane Arone and others to be mercilessly killed. I can't draw a direct line, But I will implore you to think about this. The Airborne Regiment was already a spark. Was Mefloquin the gasoline? Marge Matchie knows all too well the effects of Mefloquin. Marge was married to Clayton Matchie. If you've been listening to the series, you know Clayton Matchie was the man responsible for the torture and murder of Shidane Arone. He was not held criminally responsible because after he was taken into custody in Somalia and held for questioning, he attempted suicide by hanging, which left him permanently disabled. But when the truths emerged of Shidane's death, the media published the horrific photographs that are forever imprinted in the minds of anyone who saw them. There is Clayton Matchie, posed beside a bleeding and bruised Shidane Arone. Clayton almost looks proud of his handiwork. And the 17-year-old Shidane Arone dies shortly after the photos are taken. The world is left believing Clayton Matchie is an absolute monster. In her heart, Marge knows there is no way her husband could have done what he did if he was in his right mind. She said, quote, "This boy, Shidane Arone, would not be dead today, I believe in my heart, if those soldiers were not on Mefloquin. I want the public to know Clayton isn't a murderer. No one can understand just how bad this drug affects a person until they have actually been there and witnessed it." End quote. Marge believes Mefloquin drove her husband to madness and was a direct factor in what happened to Shidane. Before Clayton began taking what he described to her as a military-issued antimalarial drug, he was a loving man. He loved life. He loved being a dad. He was fun to be around with a personality that could fill a room. But that all changed. He quickly morphed into a man with a quick temper. One who preferred spending time at the barracks instead of at home with his family. For more insight into Marge's story and Clayton's shift into madness, tune into the bonus episode I'm going to release alongside this one. 3 decades later, the Mefloquin chapter of the Somalia affair remains very painful. Not because there's one clear villain and not because there's one easy answer, but because it raises questions that still haven't been resolved. Would things have happened differently if soldiers were given a drug that was considered safer? Why was informed consent bypassed? And what responsibility does the military have to the physical and mental health of its members when they're ordered to take a prescribed drug? For many soldiers, Mefloquin remains part of their personal aftermath long after the headlines have faded. Val Reyes Santiesteban is the mother of Corporal Scott Smith. Corporal Smith had served in Somalia in 1992 as part of the peacekeeping mission. He was also deployed to Rwanda in 1994. He was prescribed Mefloquin by military doctors on both deployments. Tragically, on December 25, 1994, Corporal Smith ended his life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Army? They say he was killed in action, but Val, Smith's mother, says it was clearly a suicide. Her son was just 23 years old. There is no doubt in Val's mind Mefloquin was responsible for the death of her son. Before he left for Rwanda, he told a reporter that the malaria medication he was given made him hallucinate. There were other changes too. And he didn't seem like he was going to end his own life. Just hours before he died, Scott was laughing and joking with colleagues. He called his mother and father and his best friend to wish them a Merry Christmas. He was excited to go home in February and see everyone. What could have happened just a few hours later to cause him to take his own life? It wasn't just the parents or family members that noticed issues. Dr. Barry Armstrong, known as the whistleblower, had his views as well. He is perhaps best known for being the military doctor in Somalia who knew something was rotten in the Canadian compound. Through letters written to his wife, he told her there were murders being committed and cover-ups that followed. She took that information to the media, who then quickly extricated Dr. Armstrong to protect him from backlash from fellow soldiers. He later had to testify as to what was happening on Somalian soil. In 1993, Dr. Armstrong wrote a post-deployment analysis. The premise of this analysis was that the peacekeeping mission in Somalia was a complete and utter failure due to a very simple reason. Canadian and American troops may have been impaired by the use of mefloquine, end quote. These sentiments were echoed by Dr. Greg Passy, a military doctor deployed to Rwanda in 1994. He, too, noticed many issues stemming from this antimalarial drug. The military wanted to get ahead of things and sent a forces-wide communication asking anyone with information about adverse effects after taking mefloquine to come forward and speak. Dr. Passy decided he would do just that, but his decision was met with anger from senior officers. Before he could testify, the hearing was called off. There are many that can't talk about what they went through, and many that are afraid to talk about what they went through. Mental health discussions are never easy, not for anyone, let alone those bred with the military mind frame of just push through it. Claude Lalancette is not one of those individuals. Claude Lalancette is a Canadian veteran paratrooper. He proudly served his country for over 10 years as a member of the Royal 22nd Regiment and proudly served in the Canadian Airborne Regiment. On December 26, 1992, Claude was deployed to Somalia. He was provided the antimalarial drug mefloquine. And this is where it all went downhill. It began with the nightmares. Horrific, realistic nightmares. Meflomares, as they were coined by many of the soldiers. As a, quote, good paratrooper, Claude didn't complain. He simply moved on. He chalked up the nightmares to deployment stress. Once per week, the platoon medic would arrive and dole out the new antimalarial drug. There was no mention of it being unlicensed. The person handing out the meds was not qualified to know the warning signs. Claude recalls his symptoms getting progressively worse. He was becoming extremely irritable and aggressive. He remembered times where he was hopeful there would be an attack on the Canadian troops so he could blow the head off whoever did it. He would find himself pointing his gun at every Somali he saw, not just men, women and kids too. He became concerned about his desire to inflict extreme violence, as this was not in his nature. He spoke to an army medic, and he was told it was nothing. Don't worry about it. On March 4th, 1993, when Ahmed Arouche and another man were shot upon their entry to the Canadian compound, Claude Lalancette was there. He witnessed the murder of Ahmed Arouche. It didn't seem right, but everyone seemed to be changing and developing a violent mindset. It was becoming obvious there were personality changes among the troops taking mefloquine. Claude witnessed individuals doing things that were completely out of character. The hallucinations were affecting many of the soldiers. Some would even leave the compound to go hunting for Somalis. At one point, Claude began to hear beating drums, but couldn't figure out where they were coming from. He was becoming increasingly paranoid. He recalls the night Clayton Machi tortured Shadon Arone. This was the same night where Clayton, wild-eyed, was using a baton to slap the walls, screaming he was killing camel spiders. But there were no spiders in sight. Eventually, Claude returned home to Canada, but his nightmare was far from over. Claude was called to testify about the March 4th incident in Somalia as part of the Somalian inquiry. Superior officers warned him to keep quiet and give as little detail as possible. Caught between a rock and a hard place, the stress was ever increasing. Claude admits he lied under oath to save the careers of his colleagues and himself. From there, though, he became an outcast in his unit. His life began to take a number of wrong turns. His hours in the army were cut, and he had to get another job just to make ends meet for his family, a wife and 2 sons. Claude's military career collapsed. Claude maintains that Mefloquine is in part, if not fully, responsible for how his life played out after Somalia. He was doing things he never would have done prior to his deployment, things completely outside of his normal character. He was charged with sexual assault against a sex worker and served 2 years in jail. There were multiple arrests for extreme violence in 3 separate road rage incidents. This led to a diagnosis of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. He gained weight and ended up being diagnosed with diabetes. All the while, he was asking Veterans Affairs to help him figure out how to navigate these challenges. And the paranoia he mentioned having in Somalia? That never went away. He eventually fled the country to Central America, where he lived deep in the bush and survived by selling fish he caught. When he eventually returned to Canada, he was homeless for a year. He tried to get health benefits through Veteran Affairs, but each time his claims were denied, canceled, or suspended. He suspects it's because he mentioned the word nobody in the military wants to hear: Mefloquine. Claude lost his wife to divorce. His kids do not want a relationship with him. His reputation is completely tarnished. And none of these traits were ones he had prior to taking Mefloquine. Today, Claude is an active speaker against what he says is a national health crisis. He has written and presented facts to the House of Commons and tirelessly fights to change public opinion on the actions of Clayton Matchey and Private Kyle Brown, who was the first convicted of a crime against Jadane Arone. Claude knows these men wouldn't have committed the acts they did if it weren't for the new antimalarial drug they were forced to take. In 2001, a class action lawsuit was filed against the Canadian government on behalf of veterans who served in Somalia, and they were ordered to take the drug. The case was dismissed due to delay in 2018. Since then, there have been a number of mass torts and individual lawsuits representing veterans and former service members against the government of Canada. And there is a global precedent. Other allied nations have seen success in such cases. For example, the UK Ministry of Defence settled over 400 military claims regarding side effects of Mefloquine. Ireland also had similar numbers of settled cases for military claimants. These lawsuits assert Mefloquine is a potent psychotropic antimalarial drug that can cause severe and potentially permanent neurological and psychological health harms. The drug manufacturer now provides warnings confirming that Mefloquine can cause prolonged and sometimes permanent severe mental health problems, including anxiety, paranoia, depression, hallucinations, suicidal thoughts, mood disorders, and severe nervous system problems. The Government of Canada continued to force Canadian Armed Forces members to take Mefloquine on pain of court-martial, even after severe adverse reactions were reported, and the drug manufacturer warned that if individuals were experiencing adverse reactions, they needed to stop taking the drug immediately. Hundreds of CAF members have returned home with long-term and, in many cases, permanent disabilities caused by Mefloquine. And tragically, Mefloquine toxicity has been a major factor in the suicide crisis that was plaguing military veterans and their families in the 2000s. The lawsuit maintains all of this could have been avoided if the Government of Canada had utilized any of the multitude of alternative antimalarial drugs available. For years, family members and veteran soldiers have tried to bring light to the reality of Mefloquine. Often, their concerns have fallen on deaf ears or been dismissed. While the lawsuits are promising, what the outcome will be remains to be seen. As of June 2026, the Department of Justice went to court to try to dismiss or completely halt the lawsuits filed by Canadian veterans who suffered permanent side effects of mefloquine. This hearing was a procedural battleground that will dictate whether the veterans' cases can move forward to trial or if they will be blocked entirely. Over 2 days, lawyers representing both the veterans and the Canadian government presented oral arguments at the Federal Court of Canada. Judge Michael Crinson heard the arguments brought forward. The government filed 2 aggressive legal requests to block the case, motion to strike and motion to stay, both of which would block ongoing lawsuits. Judge Crinson reserved his decision, which means he did not feel he could immediately rule whether or not to dismiss the lawsuits. He will review the evidence and submissions and issue a written decision in the coming weeks or months. Timelines can vary, but the Canadian Judicial Council aims for decisions within 6 months. The hearing is over. The arguments have been made. And now, once again, the soldiers wait. They have been waiting for decades. For answers, for acknowledgement, for someone in a position of power to say, we knew and we should have done better. For Claude Lancet, the wait cost him his marriage, his children, his home, and years of his life spent in the bush of Central America trying to outrun a paranoia he never asked for. For Val Reyes Santiesteban, the wait means spending every Christmas anniversary without her son, a 23-year-old who called home to say Merry Christmas just hours before he died. For Marge Matchy, the wait means watching the world remember her husband as a monster, while she remembers the man who loved being a dad. A judge is now reviewing the evidence. He will issue a written decision. And somewhere in that language of the ruling will be a message. Not just to the veterans who filed the lawsuits, but to every soldier who is handed a pill and told not to worry about it. That message will either say, your suffering matters, or it will say something else entirely. The Canadian Airborne Regiment was disbanded. The inquiry was shut down. Careers were ended. Lives were destroyed. And a small, bitter pill sits at the center of all of it, still largely unexamined, still largely unacknowledged. The question that opened this episode is worth asking one more time. Was mefloquine the gasoline? We may never get an answer, but the men and women who lived through it, the ones still living through it, deserve more than silence.